And thank you for joining the Fort Worth Public Library and TCU's Center for Texas Studies for Preserving Our Past. I am Linda Barrett, and I'm with the Genealogy, Local History, and Archives Unit of the Fort Worth Public Library. I had some upcoming programs on a slide before we actually went live here. But if you're interested in seeing other upcoming programs, you can check the Fort Worth Public Library's homepage. There's a calendar on there with all the events on it. And I've got a link to the homepage in the chat. And we do have a couple of programs on there that I'd like to call your attention to. On Wednesday, the 15th of September at noon, there is an ID theft prevention program on Zoom, virtual. And then on Thursday evening, on the 16th, we are doing the third Thursday jazz program. It will be outdoors at the North Side branch of the library. Ole Mano will be playing, and that starts at 6:30. And now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Leanna Schooley with TCU's Center for Texas Studies. Leanna?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Center for Texas Studies and the library, we're just really glad that you're willing to Zoom with us one more time, at least one more time. We hope to be in person with you again as soon as we can. And as those of you who have received some of our emails have known, we're going to be reviewing things on a case-by-case basis. And as soon as we feel like we can get you back in person, then we're going to be doing that. So keep an eye out for information on all of our sources, our social medias, and on our website. And we'll be keeping you informed on where and how to watch the October program, which will be Fort Worth native Mark Presswood, who will be discussing the history of baseball in Fort Worth, which I think will be super interesting. That comes just as baseball season will be ending, so it will be a very timely program for us. I want to tell you that we are able to bring you these programs through a generous grant from the Summerfield G. Roberts Foundation and the Summerlee Foundation. We are very grateful for them providing this funding for us, because we want to share with you how you can preserve your own past, just like the speakers that we bring you on a regular basis. They do it through music, they do it through oral history, they do it through preservation. And today you're going to hear a little bit about how Dr. Monahan has preserved some of the history of early civil rights and Reconstruction Texas. I want to give you a couple of instructions about today. You can ask your questions anytime throughout the program. Please do that in the Q&A section by pressing the little Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen. You can also shoot us some emergency comment in the chat if you need to do that, but please try to keep your Q&A to the Q&A section. We will be answering all of the questions at the end, and there'll be plenty of time to do that. I want to also mention that this program will eventually be on YouTube in a few weeks. So if you have to drop out midway, you can always go back and catch it at a later date. And we'll be giving you that information. As I said, we're on social media, on Instagram and on Facebook, so you can always follow us for information about what the center is doing, what's going on in Texas history, research tips, information about our programs, and publications. All of that is on our social media, which is Center for Texas Studies at TCU. And let's see, I've already told you about our next program, so I'm going to introduce our program today, who is a longtime friend of the Center for Texas Studies. Dr. Carl Monahan is a professor emeritus at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. He is a scholar of Civil War and Reconstruction history. And among his many publications are two for the Center for Texas Studies Texas Biography series. This is one of the projects we do with TCU Press, and we work to highlight individuals in Texas history who have either never had a scholarly biography done or have no biography at all on them. So his two examples are his first work for us, which was Edmund J. Davis, Civil War general, Republican leader, and Reconstruction governor. And then his most recent one, which came out just as COVID hit, which is George T. Ruby, champion of civil rights and Reconstruction in Texas. And that's who we will be discussing today. But I also want to mention that in his COVID time and in his retirement, he has also been producing another work, and in fact, a couple of new works. One just came out in the last couple of weeks, and it is The Union League, Biracial Politics and Biracial Politics in Reconstruction Texas. So you can look for that. You can look for the Edmund J. Davis book and the George T. Ruby book at TCU Press. And with that, I'm going to let Carl tell us all about George Ruby. Carl?
Thank you. Special thanks to Leanna and Linda for facilitating this morning's event. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I would have preferred to have been here with you in person. I think that's a lot more fun, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about George T. Ruby this morning, and a person I think that more Texans really need to know about, someone who I think had a very important role in Texas history. So again, thank you all very much. I'd like to talk first of all this morning, something about writing a biography of George Ruby. I want to talk a little bit about how I came to write this biography. I'll then turn to give you an overview of his life and my observations concerning what motivated him and his approach to securing the goals that he sought. And finally, I want to spend some time talking about the revolution in research resources that I think made possible this biography. I'm not sure that it could have been done even 20 years ago, but I think there's been a major change in what we can access, in large part due to the internet. To begin with, why did I decide to write a biography of George Ruby? Ruby has been known to scholars of Texas history, of course, for a long time. He was, after all, a Black man who served in the Texas State Senate. That made him particularly unique in the 19th century. Now, the problem was among earlier scholars, I think, people like Charles W. Ramsdell, he was considered to be largely insignificant. Ramsdell only called him essentially, quote, a mulatto carpetbagger from New England who generally led the Negroes. That's essentially the whole of what he said. And for Ramsdell, Ruby was largely a tool of white radical Republicans. When William C. Nunn took up the story of Reconstruction after the state government was returned to the Union in 1870, he mentions Ruby, but relegates him largely to a footnote. Now, revisionist historians writing after the 1960s came to the study of Reconstruction with a whole different set of assumptions, most notably that Blacks possessed legitimate interests in the outcome of the process. This brought about heightened interest in men like Ruby, and in the 1970s and 1980s, historians such as the late Barry Crouch, the late Jim Smallwood, and Merlene Petrie, who's at Texas Southern University, all wrote book chapters or articles on Ruby. In fact, I even contributed to this scholarship with a chapter in a book on Southern Black leadership that appeared in 1982, a very, very, very long time ago. What struck me about this scholarship as I became involved in it was how differently each of us saw Ruby. Professor Petrie, I think, wondered if he was motivated more by self-interest and concern for his place in the state's Republican Party than in pursuing a program for the good of his race. Another scholar, I don't call him a Reconstruction scholar because he went on to write a biography of Lyndon Johnson. Another scholar, Randall Woods, didn't believe he was a true reformer. He thought he was more interested in ingratiating himself with the business community in Galveston than pursuing a more radical agenda. Smallwood and Crouch found him to be enigmatic and were unsure what motivated him. Now, these varying interpretations discomforted me. Were some conclusions right? Were some wrong? And I ultimately came to recognize that these multiple interpretations reflected the fact that as biographers, each of us looked at his life cross-sectionally. That is, we examined Ruby at a particular time in his life, at a particular crossroads. Of course, that is all you can do in the published works that we were producing at that time, articles and book chapters. But that observation convinced me that if we were ever to fully understand Ruby, we would have to take a look at him longitudinally. We would have to look at his entire life. What I found when I approached Ruby from this particular perspective is that at varying times, he may have been in the process of developing overarching goals. But at the same time, once he established them, he remained true to them throughout his career. I think at other times, we see him changing tactics. That explains, I think, one of the reasons why we find him doing different things. We can come up with different interpretations. In some ways, my experience with George Ruby served as something of a warning. A full life, or at least as much of it as possible to uncover, must be addressed to be fair to your subject. Cross-sections of one's life tell us little about who a person is. And I decided I was going to find out who George Ruby was. Now, who then was George Ruby? I think we need to spend some time looking at his life prior to his arrival in Texas in 1866. I think the insight gained from that period is critical to understanding the man. So, Ruby was actually born in New York City in 1841. His parents were Reuben and Rachel Ruby, a free Black couple. Now, the Rubys actually were from Portland, Maine, but had temporarily moved to New York. We don't know exactly the reason, but it appears that Reuben may have gotten into a legal conflict, with some members of his church back in Portland, the Abyssinian Church. Now, we know almost nothing about George Ruby in the first 15, 16 years of his life, but we do know something about his family. We know that he grew up in a family, and we know that he must have been influenced by them. They were a family committed to a wide range of reform movements. And I think that they helped him form his basic values. They perceived their race as facing barriers to what they would think of as full freedom, and they fought to remove those barriers. In the 1830s, Reuben became part of the anti-slavery movement and was one of the founding members of the Maine Anti-Slavery Society. In doing this, he attacked the institution that free Blacks in the North saw as not only restricting the lives of slaves, but also as demeaning their own lives. The family also joined the temperance movement of the era, seeking to bring an end to a problem that they considered to be endemic to their own society, their own race, and that was alcoholism. And they believed that alcoholism limited the race's upward movement. In New York, Reuben actually operated what he called a cold water restaurant. Food, no alcohol. In New York, both Reuben and Rachel also pushed for extending voting rights to Blacks, believing that only through political power could some of their goals be achieved. In the 1850s, on returning to Portland, Reuben operated as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved people escape to Canada. He also became an open and vocal opponent of the fugitive slave law that charged the federal government with pursuing runaways and had been part of the Compromise of 1850. All of these activities, I think, provided the framework within which George Ruby developed, and his own actions over time demonstrated that to some degree, at varying times, he embraced the same sort of goals and tactics used by his parents in their own lives. I think his family was formative. We actually began to know a little bit more about George when the family returned to Portland sometime in the late 1840s. His father in 1849 left for California to be a part of the gold rush. And in fact, Reuben came back with some significant amounts of gold. But at that time, his family returned to Portland. Ruby, we don't know for sure, but Ruby probably was in the public schools of New York City. Whether he was or not is uncertain, but we do know for sure that he entered the state-sponsored schools in Portland. Now, they were segregated when he returned, and he went to school at a school within the Abyssinian church there. Now, I think he was influenced greatly by his teachers. His church's pastor emphasized a classical education. In a sense, Ruby would have studied when he got to Portland literature, history, languages, and the various sciences. And Ruby's later erudition, his writing skills, what he referred to suggests that he took those lessons seriously. When the pastor let go of the school, it was taken over by a young man, a young Black man who was studying for the law at the time. And I think this young man provided an example of how, with hard work and education, a Black man at least could aspire to any goal. I think that these men in particular added to the Ruby family's ideas that, at least in part, for Blacks to achieve equality, they would have to raise themselves up in order to confront the racist beliefs that suggested that they were inferiors and would always be so. Then, and I think a major step that may have helped promote Ruby's own belief in himself and in the values of his family, he entered an integrated high school in 1856 when the Abyssinian school was forced to close because of a lack of students. He competed for the first time with white students and appeared to be quite successful. He became Portland High School's first Black graduate, and he graduated with what one contemporary referred to as high honors. I don't know exactly what happened. In fact, one of the things I tried to do was to find something out about school records in Portland, and unfortunately, they no longer survive. He was also described at that time as a man of fine natural abilities. Now, we have to look at Ruby to a certain degree through other people's eyes up to that point. But I think we can finally begin to see who Ruby was himself, who he wanted to be, and how he wanted to be that after 1861. At the age of 20, he moved to Haiti, where he intended to become a settler as a part of one of the colonies of free Blacks from the United States that the Haitian government was trying to create. When he arrived, he began sending letters to a Boston newspaper called the Pine and Palm, a paper operated by one of the operatives for the colonial effort in the United States, a guy named James Redpath. These are the first surviving literary works produced by the young man. And we can begin at this time to see him develop his ideas about freedom, and with that, equality. Freedom to him, to a large degree, meant equality, and what he believed the basic elements of freedom to be. What was freedom? Ruby explained that he had gone to Haiti searching for a place where a Black man would be treated equally. What did living equally mean to Ruby at this point? In this first stage of development of his broader goals, he clearly associated equality with economic opportunity. To be equal, to be free, was to have the right to pursue whatever economic goals that you wanted without artificial barriers. It was a concept of freedom not unlike that associated with the Free Soil movement that had been part of the root of the Republican Party. Economic independence was real freedom. Economic success, he further believed, would force whites to accept Blacks as equals. Now, he praised Haiti as a place where Blacks could engage in commercial, professional, and agricultural pursuits that would allow them to get ahead economically. The right of equal access to economic prospects came to be seen as a key component of the broader potential for racial equality that Ruby sought, and would be something he worked for throughout the rest of his career, both for himself and his race. It was in many ways the cornerstone of his developing belief system that concluded that there were certain natural rights that existed for all human beings, and that society, to create true freedom, had to ensure these rights for all. Society, in his view, owed as a right to all of its people the opportunity for economic self-sufficiency. It's not exactly clear what economic activity Ruby hoped to engage in when he went to Haiti, but he may have worked at least for a time as a teacher. And in doing so, he came to see access to education as another critical component to achieving true freedom. He may already have believed this to be true before he went to Haiti. Certainly his background emphasized the importance of education. His writings from Haiti, however, provide the first indication that he had personally internalized this idea. For him, freedom would mean not only the ability to achieve economic success, but also to gain what he would refer to as a civilized status. I was struck particularly by the letters he wrote after seeing a sign on the way out of one of the towns that he had visited. It was a sign that included a picture of liberty, and then on each side of the picture of liberty were the words civilization and religion. To Ruby, the sign meant that freedom was a God-given right. But the sign also suggested to him that freedom had to be gained. And part of that is that men had to raise themselves up to be truly equal. Using God's gift of reason, mankind must use it, in his terms, to, quote, rise above the brute and become civilized, unquote. What made this possible? How did you rise above the brute and become civilized? Ruby believed it was by securing education. And so within just a year in Haiti, we can begin to see this kind of structure developing, ideas of the basis of freedom, that somehow if we were going to be truly free, if he was going to be truly free, he had to have economic opportunity, he had to have access to economic opportunity, but he also had to secure education. Now in Haiti, I think we can also begin to see how Ruby shifted his position on how he thought all this could be achieved. How did you secure economic opportunity? How did you secure education? And at this stage, I think he must be considered to be something of a Black nationalist who believed that only in a community without whites could Blacks secure true freedom and be equal to whites. Now, I think perhaps his own experiences may have in part led him to this conclusion. We can't know for sure, but he must have been disappointed after graduating from high school and doing very well in high school. And as his fellow students went on to become lawyers, doctors, ministers, and teachers, he was forced to work with his brother as a baker for a year or two. And he may have seen that as being essentially because whites presented a barrier to success. His letters from Haiti initially showed his optimism for the possibilities of the advancement of Black Americans, but only if they moved to a world free from white suppression. His letters were filled with amazement at the accomplishments of the Haitian people. And he was particularly struck by the fact that Blacks owned businesses and farms, were in the professions, held public offices, all accomplishments largely restricted to whites in the United States. In a scathing letter written in September 1862, he condemned the United States for its failure to do anything for Blacks. Had even the war made it possible for Blacks to make gains, he answered, no. Blacks, he believed, in fact, had become the subject of even more discrimination, subjected to mob assaults in northern states, and dealt with unequally by the government. That was not the future of the race, he believed. blacks were not to be eternally the pariah, he would write. And instead of fighting it out in the United States, hoping for things to be better, he urged blacks to come to Haiti, where they could build, and I want to quote this, a nationality which shall stand through all time, a monument of African independence and glory, unquote. So in a sense, at least at this point, I think Ruby was pretty much convinced that whites would never open up the way for blacks succeed. Now, despite his initial optimism about the prospects presented by resettlement in Haiti, his experiences there ultimately forced a reassessment and a shift to a new tack. Ruby left Haiti, returned to Portland after only a year. The reason he came back to Maine was he had contracted yellow fever and he went home to recover. But while he was gone, the development of the immigrant settlements collapsed when the Haitian government failed to build canals essential for the opening of farmlands. It turned out that even a black government could fail to provide the framework within which true freedom could be accomplished. Ruby had come to see all these things as central, and Haiti, in the end, failed. Now, I'm not sure that it's clear that Ruby ever completely surrendered his beliefs that blacks would be better off in an all-black society. But his experiences in the years after his return to the United States suggest that his views of how to proceed were beginning to change, that there was not going to be a place where blacks could operate by themselves. In fact, he appears to have become somewhat optimistic about the possibilities for blacks being produced by the Civil War. His brother was a cook with the Union Army in the South at this time, and George became aware of what was happening among the freedmen where the Union Army had brought an end to slavery. Blacks in those areas appeared to have the opportunity to work as free laborers and also to have access to education for the first time. This may have been a gross assessment of what was actually taking place, but Ruby came to believe there was a chance for a change even in the United States. Now, he would write again of his belief that as the race improved itself, whites would be forced to recognize black accomplishments. And that would ultimately open the way for an equal place in society. The problem now, he believed, was ensuring this self-improvement, and he determined to be an agent for the cause. In 1863, he moved to Louisiana, where he became a school teacher. He initially earned a sterling reputation teaching in some of the poorest schools in Louisiana, particularly in the sugar plantation regions just to the east of New Orleans. He was so successful that ultimately he was brought to New Orleans itself, where he headed one of the black schools created by the United States Army there. And in the letters he would be writing that would appear in newspapers, including William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, he would repeatedly talk about the success that he saw taking place among freedmen, that they were learning, they were being educated, and they were moving forward. Now, I don't think Ruby ever abandoned this idea of self-help as being central to changing race relations. But the Louisiana experience confronted him with another real impediment to Black progress. I mean, he had encountered prejudice, I'm sure, in Maine. But in Louisiana, he found that many whites were not only prejudiced, they were unwilling to give Blacks any more rights than they had given Blacks as slaves. In fact, he found many of the whites he dealt with expressing a hatred for Black schools and standing in outright opposition to his efforts at creating them. He not only encountered whites who were opposed to Black education, but he also began to see that many whites were unwilling to allow Blacks to act as free laborers, thus denying them that right of self-determination. And he personally encountered violence in 1866. A mob took him from his home in Jackson, Louisiana. He was there trying to create a Black school. They took him out, they beat him until he could not walk and threatened to kill him. He managed to escape, swam across a bayou and managed to get to New Orleans. But I think suddenly we see Ruby again in his letters writing about a third component that he saw as critical to freedom. And that was that Blacks not only must be given or have access to economic opportunity, that they must not only, if you will, have access to education, but they also had to have equal protection in the law. Only then could freedom be achieved. Now, all of this brings us to Texas. In 1866, the 25-year-old teacher lost his job in Louisiana. The public school system created by the United States Army failed. Congress provided no funding for the schools. Louisiana didn't have the money for the schools. But at this very time, the Freedmen's Bureau was organizing a new public school system in Texas. Many of Ruby's acquaintances from the schools in Louisiana were moving to Texas, and so Ruby came along. When he arrived, he initially taught in a school in Galveston. And again, like in Louisiana, he gained a reputation as a very good teacher, but he also gained a reputation as someone who worked well with people of his own race. Many of the teachers were white. The Bureau quickly discovered essentially that he possessed organizational skills and that, if you will, ability to work with the freedmen. And as a result, he left teaching, became a special agent of the Bureau. The Bureau sent him to organize schools in counties along the Brazos and Colorado rivers. Those have been counties all that had been heavily involved in the antebellum plantation economy. They quickly found that he exercised what they would call great influence among the freedmen. And they found that almost everywhere he went, schools were being started. It is in this period, I think, that we begin to see in his travels across Texas, we can begin to see him forging links within local Black communities. And those links, I think, would help provide him a political base later in his life. Now, as a teacher in Texas, Ruby's ideas about the underpinnings of freedom further matured. He came to see that in addition to all of the other rights that provided the foundation for freedom, the right to vote also was essential if the whole was to be secured. In Ruby, we can see him now kind of slowly putting together this overarching view of the character of freedom and identifying essentially what had to exist in a society for freedom to exist. Now, I think he comes to that conclusion, at least in part, because he sees what's happening in Texas at this time. And Ruby, again, proves to be an inveterate letter writer. And at this point, he's writing back to newspapers in New Orleans, and he becomes highly critical of the new state government that had just taken office in 1866, led by Governor James W. Throckmorton, and a legislature, incidentally, filled with farmer Confederates. And what he concludes in his criticism of Throckmorton and the legislature is that white Texas government had no intention of supporting the aspirations of freedom held by the freedmen. He was particularly critical of the state legislature. The state legislature had passed black codes. The black codes essentially seriously restricted, I guess you could call the freedom of Blacks to make contracts and make economic decisions on their own. In fact, the black codes forced Blacks to make contracts for the upcoming year by the end of January or they would be dealt with as vagrants. Essentially, there was no freedom there. They had to make a contract. It, in a sense, put many of them black onto plantations where the rules remained much like they were under slavery. In fact, the law required that for them to leave the plantation, to be on the public byways, they would have to have permission. In addition to that, if these laws denied them a part of the school fund, essentially blacks had nothing, no resources in Texas at the war's end, certainly not enough money to pay for schools, and yet the legislature denied them access to the state school fund. In addition to this, blacks could get essentially no protection in the courts at this time. Judges and court officials essentially allowed landowners to cheat their workers. They allowed criminals to rob and murder freedmen, and there was no punishment. Ruby would write that rebels continued to rule with all the venom of slavery. And he concluded that only black political participation offered a cure for such an abuse of power. Action had to be taken. And again, as a letter writer, now writing to many northern newspapers, he explained what was going on in Texas, and he urged Congress to intervene. And when they intervened, to force black voting on the South. Only that way did he believe freedom could be guaranteed. Now, in the spring of 1867, Congress intervened in Reconstruction. It labeled the governments like that of Governor Throckmorton provisional, to be replaced at a future date. Under congressional reconstruction, each of the southern states would have to have new constitutional conventions. And the delegates to these conventions would be elected on the basis of universal adult male suffrage. Blacks would be allowed to vote. This was what Ruby had hoped for, and black voting opened the way for the next stage of Ruby's career and launched him into Texas politics, where he would play a major role through the course of Reconstruction. In fact, I think if Ruby's not there, Texas Reconstruction might have gone in a completely different direction. Ruby now had the opportunity that proved that if blacks voted, they could create a government in which the limits on their natural rights could be overturned. And Ruby intended to play a role in the process. White Unionists had, to a considerable degree, been responsible for overturning the presidential Reconstruction. And in Texas, they organized the state's Republican Party. That was to be the vehicle that they would use to secure power. They recognized that newly enfranchised black voters would be the way to office. And they saw men like Ruby as natural organizers who would educate blacks politically and in favor of their party. At the same time, they discouraged blacks from running for office. Ruby never took that advice to heart. He early made it clear that he intended to run for a seat in the state's new constitutional convention. And he immediately set establishing himself in the community in a way that he could get support, particularly from among black voters in Galveston. He used the city's Union League to accomplish that. Now, the Union League was a secret organization introduced in Texas in 1867 to prepare blacks for their new roles as voters. But he, in a sense, used the League as the core of his own base. And he upended white expectations when he, rather than white candidates, was elected the local council's first president. And at the same time that he was shoring up a base in Galveston within the black community, we also see that he continues to travel and make contact with the black community throughout the state. And I think at this stage, we can begin to see Ruby shifting strategies in efforts to secure his larger goals. I said earlier that I thought that when you take a look at things cross-sectionally, you see one. Well, I think what's going on now and will happen into the 1870s is that Ruby will continue to shift tactics to secure his broader goals. In 1868, he was running for office in Galveston County. And there was a demographic reality. In the registration, Blacks outnumbered whites, with 953 men registered to 801 whites. As a result, when he campaigned for office, he appealed directly to Black voters. He made some overtures to whites, but he appealed primarily to Black voters. And he promised his largely Black audiences that in office, he would empower them and help them achieve their basic rights. In one speech during his canvass, he assured Blacks that he had always worked for the well-being of his race and that he would continue to stand by them always. And contemporary observers noted to a certain degree that he inspired hope and interest and excitement among local Blacks. Now, he didn't completely ignore whites, but he faced a real problem. Whites questioned whether a Black man could represent Galveston, and he promised them, again, I want to give you this quotation. He promised, quote, by his color, he would represent the Black man, but by his brains, talents, and culture, he could represent the white man. I'm not sure how well that set with his white observers, but at least he was telling them he could represent them. When the results came in, Ruby defeated his opponent, overwhelming them. He received 900 votes. Now remember, there were 953 Blacks registered. He got 900 votes. Contemporary observers concluded that he basically won by securing the vote of almost all Black voters. Now we know he received some white votes, but certainly his base at this point was the Black voter. Contemporaries were surprised, white contemporaries. One newspaper has suggested that Blacks would be swayed by what they call the wise counsel of their white politicians. That had been a miscalculation. They were not swayed. They voted for a Black man who promised to deliver. Now, the problem Ruby faced, and here suddenly we're going to have to change a little bit. The problem Ruby faced was that when he got to the convention in Austin in 1868, he was in a minority. He was part of a 10-man Black minority in the convention out of the 90 people in the convention. And he now had to shift gears. He had to prove that he could work with whites in order to secure any of the protections he considered essential to freedom. And he appears to have approached this problem by bringing together most of the other Blacks elected to the convention in a voting bloc. How he did this is not clear, but he emerged as the primary spokesman for the Black delegation. Forging this bloc was critical because neither he nor the delegates had any real power, but as a group, they were able to throw their weight behind whites in the convention who were willing to concede to them the greatest amount of protection. That role as the leader of the Black delegation made it possible, I think, for Ruby to influence the course of the convention through its 2 sessions. Throughout, he pushed white Republicans to write and adopt a constitution that he believed was necessary for the well-being of his race. He called for, quote, a free constitution that would place whites and Blacks upon a perfect equality before the law. Now, during the sessions, he remained focused on securing provisions in the new Constitution that ensured those equal rights. He argued for the creation of a state militia to protect the Black community, its institutions, its schools, and its voting. Now, I think you've got to understand what's going on at this time. Why does he believe a military force is necessary to be created? 1868, in the summer of 1868, the Ku Klux Klan is running rampant in many of the old plantation counties in Texas. In fact, you see almost you see the development of a race war at this particular time as Blacks resist. But Ruby believed that ultimately the only protection could come from the state. He also hoped for other kinds of things, which he was not successful in getting. He hoped for, say, for example, provisions that would have required almost any kind of public institution to be open to Blacks. He wanted Blacks to be allowed to homestead the state's lands. The whites prevented that from happening. But on the other hand, he supported and did manage to have incorporated into the Constitution Section 21 of the new Constitution's Bill of Rights. Now, I'm going to read this section again. I want to quote this. And the Section 21 reads, "The equality of all persons before the law is herein recognized, and shall ever remain inviolate. Nor shall any citizen ever be deprived of any right, privilege, or immunity, nor be exempted from any burdens or duties on account of color or previous condition." That was accepted. And that section grafted into the Constitution the central tenet of Ruby's ideas about the pillars of freedom: equal protection before the law. I think it's worth noting, incidentally, that this section disappeared in the Constitution of 1876. During the first session of the convention, Ruby also, I think, expanded and strengthened his ties with the larger Black community in the state. This happened when the Union League, that organization that had been introduced by white Republicans in 1867, held a state convention in Austin shortly after the Constitutional Convention assembled. By this time, Blacks across the state had been organized into local councils, and the League was a critical component of marshaling Black voting strength behind policy. Whites had controlled the League up to this point, and in a surprise as much as that surrounding his election to the convention, or his election even to be the president of the Galveston Union League, Ruby was elected president of the state organization. And he defeated James Bell, a former Supreme Court justice who had previously been the head of the League. And at that moment, Ruby becomes, to a certain degree, the leader of Black voters across the state. He achieves a considerable amount of power to be able to throw his influence behind projects he supports. As a result, and this is where I said earlier, I think that Ruby helps to determine the course of Reconstruction. In August of 1868, he was able to decisively influence the direction of Reconstruction when Republicans break into two rival parties. Whites were fighting at this particular point. White Republicans were fighting over two issues. One of them was the legality of laws passed between 1861 and 1866. And some white Republicans argued that none of those laws should be considered legal. This is the so-called ab initio conflict. Another set of factions developed over the question of the future of Texas, with one faction arguing at this point that the state should be divided. Western Texans particularly wanted to be clear of East Texas at this particular point because they considered that to be a place run by politicians from Houston and Galveston who were using all the state's resources in their particular interest. Now, that faction, those factions had existed from the beginning of the convention, and Ruby had always essentially said, no, 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 we can't do this. We've got to stay together. We have to remain unified to get a constitution across that will accomplish our broader goals. But that didn't help. When the Republicans did divide, Ruby initially refused to embrace either of the factions. But the split offered Ruby the opportunity to push each to embrace fuller recognition of Black rights, thus advancing his broader agenda. The result was that the faction that came to be known as the Radicals gained Ruby's support with a platform that endorsed public schools organized without regard to race. Their platform also proposed to change residency and property owning requirements for holding public office, reducing the length of residency and getting rid of property owning requirements, because they argued these were prescriptive measures that would have prevented many Blacks from ever obtaining elected positions. The Radical platform even included the suggestion that if they could implement ab initio, farmer slaves might have to be paid wages back to the date of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Having made these concessions, Ruby backs this group. And what he does when he does that is he essentially brings the mass of Black voters to support the Radicals led by James P. Newcomb and future Governor Edmund J. Davis, thus, I think, helping to determine what was going to happen down the road. In the elections that take place, that's exactly what happens. He brings Black support to those candidates, and he makes it possible for them to win office. It could have been different. Now, in the 1869 election, Ruby also ran for a seat in the Senate and was elected. Again, now going back to Black power to obtain his office. The Senate district in which he ran consisted of Galveston, Missouri, and Matagorda counties. And in those counties, if you put them all together, Blacks held a majority. And he directly appealed once again to that base. And he won. And he went to the state Senate in 1870. In the state Senate, however, once again, he was in a minority. There were only 2 Black state senators. But now he had proven he could work with white Republicans. And so he again plays a significant role in pushing forward an agenda moving toward accomplishing those elements of freedom that he believes so essential for the future. Ruby, to a large degree, facilitates the passage of the state's public school laws, which finally put the state behind the creation of public schools to which Blacks can go. He actually supported the possibility, although he didn't say this was necessary, but he actually supported the possibility of integrated schools. And he pushed for a candidate for superintendent, a guy named Joseph Talbot, but he wasn't able to get Talbot in place. It was Ruby who, again, and very often what he does here is kind of interesting. He actually uses the Union League. He actually uses the Union League to put pressure on recalcitrant Republicans, radical Republicans, and he successfully uses that to secure passage of the Davis administration's militia bills and the creation of a state police force. 2 elements that are essential, if you will, if Blacks were going to be protected in their basic political and civil rights. I think that there's no question that in the Senate he helps and facilitates the passage of the government's agenda. Now, it's interesting. Again, I think if you take a look at the whole of his life, I mean, he's busy doing all sorts of other things as well. I mean, while he's working to secure protection in the law, he never backs away completely from the idea that Blacks must work as a race to maintain those rights. And he refuses to abandon the idea of self-help. And at the very same time that he's working in the legislature, he's giving speeches around Texas, encouraging Blacks essentially to move forward. He frequently spoke about the progress made by Blacks since the war, and he insisted that this had been done almost totally through the efforts of the race itself. But he believed that Blacks needed to continue to move forward on their own. In a celebration of emancipation held in Galveston on June 19, 1872, he told his many Black listeners that emancipation had not guaranteed them the rights assured to whites. They could not relax on their march to full freedom and equality. To achieve those goals, he urged them to acquire the culture derived from education and self-respect. Being something of an educator was something that was always a part of Ruby. Now, after 1871, only a year after taking office, I think Ruby recognized that he'd have to change tactics again if his larger goals were to be secured. He realized that Black power alone had its limit in a state where whites outnumbered Blacks and in a district where changing demographics also meant that the Black majority that elected in 1869 was beginning to disappear. This forced him to shift from his reliance solely on Black voting strength to make an even greater attempt to attract white support. He had to do that if he was going to remain in office. And in this shift, I think what's kind of fascinating is he believes that his most natural allies would be businessmen in Galveston. He believed that Republican national policy was more amenable to their interests than Democratic policy. And so he hoped that by linking them to the Republican Party, but also delivering on their needs, he could swing enough whites to his support that, coupled with his Black base, he could retain power. And so we see all of a sudden in the Senate, we see him introducing and successfully moving forward many measures that they wanted. Bills ranging from the creation of new railroads to the incorporation of the company to build a ship channel from Galveston to Houston. He also supported white candidates for Congress. He supported local whites to play a greater role in the Union League. He was actually suddenly now trying to create a biracial coalition that could maintain the Republican Party in the majority, retain power that he considered critical to production of Black rights. And I think when one looks solely at this stage of his career, you can come to the conclusions that Petrie and Woods came to, that he seems to be very interested in mollifying whites. In his efforts, however, he found garnering white support difficult, since in many cases, whites came to believe they could get the same political objectives accomplished within the Democratic Party without backing a Black candidate. While able to work with whites in the Senate, Ruby was never able to find a common ground that could serve as his base for and then maintain a truly biracial coalition. 1871 also sees him begin to kind of refocus his efforts. He began increasingly to try to influence the policies of the federal government because he began to believe that that would be the only place where Black rights could be protected. Largely, again, he tried to do this through letter writing, although he went north a couple of times making speeches. He made connections with Northern politicians. Basically, he was telling Northern politicians, Republican politicians, that they were going to have to step up because Black rights were being undermined slowly in the South. Essentially, in October 1871, for example, he appeared at a conference sponsored by the Reform League of New York. In his speech at that conference, he condemned the existence of racism in American society. He called racism baseless and immoral. and something had to be done. In this particular case, he spoke in favor of legislation that had been introduced in Congress by Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Sumner's bill would have made discrimination in the use of public facilities illegal. Such discrimination, Ruby argued, was a remnant of slavery and had to be abolished. In this reform meeting, he urged people there to work, quote, until the common brotherhood of humanity, stripped of all the accidents of color, nationality, or condition of life, be everywhere recognized. Now, his support of the Sumner Bill continued in 1872, and then he would support other measures that were introduced afterwards. To support, to back him in all of this, he was partly responsible for the creation of the Galveston Civil Rights Association in 1872. And he also was a participant in the National Colored Men's National Convention, which was organized primarily to accomplish the kind of goals that Ruby wanted to accomplish at the national level. Unfortunately, at this time, the national level, politicians at the national level were becoming increasingly less interested in Southern affairs or any efforts to intervene on behalf of Blacks. As in the case of Texas, suddenly Ruby found himself facing white intransigence. Ruby also attempted to use the federal courts. If we can't get new laws passed, let's at least use the old laws that have been passed to provide protection for Blacks. In fact, he had already taken recourse to the law back in 1868. He had taken passage on a Morgan steamship from Galveston to New Orleans, and he got on board. He paid first class passage, and he was told he couldn't get a first class cabin. In fact, he was forced to stay on deck during the trip. And so what happened is Ruby sued, arguing that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 had defined his rights, and that he had been denied, if you will, his basic civil rights. And he won the case. And by the 1870s, he becomes even more active, I think, in trying to push Blacks to use the courts to protect themselves. One of the cases in 1872, for example, he helped raise funds to bring a suit against the Galveston, Houston, and Henderson Railroad after a conductor had put the wife of Sheriff Walter Burton for Bend County off of one of the trains when she refused to leave a first-class coach. Ruby insisted that under the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the railroad could not discriminate against Black passengers. Here, like his efforts at getting legislation taken care of, however, he ran into changing circumstances. In fact, by this point, the Supreme Court was in the process of gutting the enforcement of the Civil Rights Acts and the 14th Amendment, something that is clearly done by the end of the 1870s. And Ms. Burton's case never really is resolved in her favor. Now, Ruby accomplished, I think, much during his career in Texas. But ultimately, he found himself overwhelmed by the resurgent Democrats. He found himself involved in a fight against an enemy of privilege and power that refused to recognize Blacks as equals, or even in some cases as human beings. That opposition willingly played on deep racism, exploited war-generated hostility toward anything associated with emancipation, and did not hesitate to use violence to regain political power to maintain the status quo of Black subordination to whites. I think that he expressed very clearly, if you will, his realization of the hopelessness of the struggle for freedom and equality for Blacks in Texas in 1873, when he addressed the Colored Men's Convention held in Brenham on July 4th. Democrats he told listeners, should not be surprised to find blacks opposed to them, because they were, after all, the men who, quote, had set their faces in steadfast opposition to our political education and social progress with a blind spirit of malignant opposition. Ruby could not match those men with similar weapons, nor with numbers. No matter the protections created, democratic opposition slowly undermined the black vote and black rights. That meant for Ruby that he had no hope of re-election in 1873, or any chance of preventing a reversal of the gains that had been made. I'm sorry, I earlier said I don't need my phone to ring, and it just rang. So that meant for Ruby that he had no hope of re-election in 73, nor any chance of preventing a reversal of the gains that had been made under the Davis administration. After Governor Davis lost his bid for re-election in 73, Ruby left and moved to New Orleans. The collapse of the dream in Texas led to another transition in Ruby's pursuit of a world of justice. He believed that in a black majority state like Louisiana, it might still be possible to maintain black rights. He found that not to be true. At this point, he reverts to some degree to that black nationalism that he had earlier favored. In the late 1870s in Louisiana, he becomes one of the leaders of a movement known as the Exoduster Movement, which encouraged a mass migration of blacks out of the South to move somewhere like Kansas, where they could create black communities and establish full freedom. He would never, ever actually see any of this come to fruit. Still fighting for the protection of black rights, Ruby died in New Orleans in 1882 at the age of 41 in a bout of yellow fever. What can we conclude from Ruby's life? First, I think there's no question throughout it, the dominating concern was his belief that blacks could achieve equality if they could maintain their basic rights as he defined them, controlling their economic lives, securing an education, being protected in the law, and having the right to vote. This was his primary focus throughout his career. He never abandoned those goals. As to tactics, as I've shown, I hope, he shifted them. He used black power. He used black nationalism. He tried to make coalitions with whites. He worked with whites. Everything he did essentially, though, was aimed at gaining, if you will, that larger goal. So in a certain sense, I think when we look at him overall, that's what he was about. That said, I think there's another lesson to be learned from the story of George Ruby. The fact is, despite all of his efforts, he was unable to maintain the protection of the basic rights he considered essential to full freedom for his race. Reason did not win. Protection of basic rights, I think the story tells us, in the face of those wishing to subvert them, is tenuous. Securing what we think of as natural rights requires a constant fight, and that's what Ruby discovered. And it's a lesson, I think, that should resonate all the way to the present. In the end, I think anyone who looks at Ruby's life must come away thinking of him as a heroic character. Now, I grew up in Texas. He was not the sort of man Texas history traditionally has seen as a hero, certainly not when I was in school. He was not a frontiersman, wasn't a cowboy. He did not fight in the Texas Revolution or the Civil War. He was not white. But he did stand unflinchingly by his ideas of what was right and spent his entire life trying to create a Texas and an America that lived up to the promise of the Declaration of Independence. In doing so, he contributed much to the state's history as he attempted to take the state down a different path in race relations and to create a more equitable Texas. Even though he failed to achieve that goal, I think he serves as an example of what was possible and what is possible. And his biography was one I really loved writing. Thank you. Now, I was going to talk about a couple of other things, but I think maybe we can talk about those in the question and answer more readily. I mean, I said earlier, it was this couldn't have been written 20 years ago, but the resources that are now available online, newspaper archives, newspaperarchives.com, all of these kinds of resources allowed me to find Ruby in the past. The past is huge. The paper record is huge, but I was able to pull him out and actually find something of Ruby using these kinds of resources. Anyway, if you have any particular questions about resources, I think I would rather deal with this in the Q&A. This went a little longer than I thought it was going to go. Anyway, sorry.
Well, since you spoke about the sources, I have one quick question before we get to the Q&A, and that is, was it particularly challenging to track Ruby because of his many movements, not just nationally, but internationally?
Yes.
I feel like that must have been a real challenge.
It was, but again, that's one of the things that's kind of fascinating. 25 years ago, I would have had to have gone to archives to look at newspapers. I would have had to turn pages to look at newspapers. And now then all of a sudden, there's this massive amount of material available in these various kinds of digitized newspaper collections that allowed me to track him. I could find out something about his graduation from Portland High School. I could find something about his Haitian experience. I was even, didn't talk about it, but I was even able to find what little I could about his personal life. I was able to find out when he got married in 1870 and who he got married to, and why he got married to her, and what kind of dress he bought for her to wear at the wedding, that sort of thing. But no. Yet it's not easy. But on the other hand, if you devote the time, and so many of these things are now word searchable. So just put in George Ruby, George T. Ruby, and if you're pursuing any individual, you'll be amazed at what you will be able to find. I mean, it's a miracle, if you will.
I believe you. Well, let's move on. We've got a couple of questions.
Okay.
First, from our buddy Greg Cantrell. If you were writing a fictionalized version of Ruby's life, and therefore could venture beyond what could be proven by documents, would we learn about Ruby that we don't? What would we learn about Ruby that we don't learn from your scholarly biography? He says he's not asking for things that couldn't have been true, but rather what you think was probably true, but couldn't be proven from the existing sources.
Well, I think if I were writing a fictional account of this, what I couldn't find, and this was the real problem. I couldn't find, say, for example, how he related to the Black people that supported him. I mean, I could tell what he said to them and what seemed to attract them, but he must have had more personal contact with individuals at the local level, and that proved absolutely undiscoverable. How he interacted with white senators, how he interacted with white delegates to the convention. Again, I can look at the public record, but I was going to say it would be interesting to know what he said over drinks, but the fact is he didn't drink. So he was a temperance advocate. But what did they think over coffee or tea or whatever they were drinking? What did they say? What did they say to him? And unfortunately, if I were to, I think they had very good relations. Sometimes I think even he might have related well with some of the Democrat opposition. But again, that proved impossible to discover. And that's what I would like to have included. Sometimes you want to, in a biography, you want to make things more personal and you want them to become more personal. But that's the most elusive thing about it, unless they write letters. Now, he wrote a bunch of letters that are in the James Newcomb papers at University of Texas at Austin. But the sad thing about them is they're not personal. They're all political. You just don't get any sense of that kind of interaction. And that's what that's what I would add. because I think he was a charming individual. You can see that all along the way. People seem to like him. His Democratic opponents, are always negative about him, but people seem to like him. Anyway.
Well, that segues well to another question that we had, which was, what was his personal life like? And you did touch upon that, but is there anything else you can share about his wife and descendants?
I make some passing mention of it in the book. It's very hard to pin down what's going on there. I do know that his family was very proud of him. In fact, he went back to Portland at one point, and the citizens of Portland had a very big occasion for him. They had a banquet honoring a native son who'd done well, and his family was there. And so I know that he remained in contact with his family. As to his family life itself, in 1870 he gets married to Lucy Nall, Nalle, and Lucy was a former slave. She was a slave in Virginia, but her father essentially had run away, and I think they must have made it all the way to Canada. But when Ruby met her, she was living in Washington, D.C. They were apparently a wonderful couple, although it's amazing. Even at on social occasions that are covered in the newspaper, she's mentioned as being there, but of course you don't get any more feeling for him. Ultimately, they would have 3 children. All of them, Lucy and the 3 children, would all live into the 20th century. After George died in New Orleans, Lucy would go to Washington, D.C. and get a job in the printing office for the federal government. And her daughter never would get married. His daughter never would get married, but she would be a public school teacher in Washington, D.C. until she died in the 1920s. And his sons also moved north. But again, did they love each other? Did they care for each other? I think they must have, but the evidence just is sadly not there.
Okay. Going back so that we don't get too far away from one other question we had, was you mentioned newspaper archive as a resource, and one of our guests asked, did you find the Portal of Texas History a useful resource in this?
There are 4 major sources that are, I think, critical. And then there's some other smaller ones that let you get into some of the magazines and journals of the period. Newspaperarchives.com, newspapers.com. EBSCO has a bunch of national newspaper archives that usually you have to go to a university to gain access to. They're pretty expensive for a person to run. And I was going to mention, I think a brilliant archives for Texas, and particularly because it has newspapers in it that don't necessarily show up in any of the others, is the Portal to Texas History that the University of North Texas maintains. And in fact, I'm doing work on another project right now, and it seems like I spend more time in front of my computer on the Portal to Texas History. It particularly has huge copies of the Houston Telegraph that are not available elsewhere, so you can get a democratic perspective on what's going on at the time. So no. The newspaper collections are incredible. The Latter-day Saints, incidentally, if you're looking at Black history, Latter-day Saints have done this incredible job. They took the Freedmen's Bureau papers, which I looked at back in the 1970s in manuscript at the National Archives. Those were then turned into microfilm. And then the Latter-day Saints have come along and digitized the whole collection. And so particularly the school collections, you can actually do word searches in those. So if you're looking for an individual, the Freedmen's Bureau papers, of course, it's 100,000 documents, but it's still an incredible collection. And you can sit at home, have a cup of coffee, look at your computer and look for this. You can go through a lot of pages online.
That is a wonderful thing. We've moved a long way from having to sit at the microfilm reader only when the library was open.
Well, now that you mention it, when I was doing research on my original book, my first book, I would go to the Library of Congress when it opened at 9 o'clock in the morning and work there till 4 o'clock when they closed. And then I'd go to the National Archives and work until 10 o'clock that night because they stayed open late. And of course, a lot of that time was just spent waiting for things to be brought to you because they only brought you so much stuff at a time. It was onerous. It was onerous. Now then, all that's available.
Right, right. Well, back to a little bit about George himself. One of our special guests has asked, Carl, talk about his gift of oratory.
Well, he wrote brilliantly. He had a reputation. Two things. Let me address that for a second. He had a reputation for being a spellbinding speaker. I've never seen a whole speech reported. He was quick. He could put quips in. He was typical of 19th century speakers. He was able to put in all sorts of literary allusions and historical allusions into what he talked about. But in terms of presentation, he also had a reputation of having a beautiful singing voice. In fact, he's at one convention, which I can't remember exactly how it all starts out, but at one of the conventions he's at, it becomes appropriate to sing "Rally Round the Flag, Boys," and he starts off singing "Rally Round the Flags." The whole crowd joins in supporting him. It would have been fascinating. That goes back to the personal aspects of him. We have his written voice. I have no idea exactly how he must have sounded, but I know he would have been brilliant in terms of his presentation.
Okay, thank you. Linda, have you had any other questions come in?
I have not seen any. I did put a link to the James Newcomb Papers Finding Aid at UT in the chat, as well as the link to UNT's Portal to Texas History.
Incidentally, let me say something about the new book that came out. If you're interested in Black history, one of the things that I included in the new book, which Texas A&M University Press published, is there's an appendix in it in which I've listed every person who is known to have been in a local Union League council in 1870 and 1871, and that includes hundreds and hundreds of African American politicians at the local level. So just to let you know.
Perfect. Okay. Well, does anyone else have any other questions? We'll give it just a second for anybody else who has thought of something at the last minute. In the meantime, Carl, I know the research that went into this project, and we all appreciate you trying to bring us a different side of George Ruby and give us some insight into that long perspective of his life. And as we already talked about, he traveled so much. He had such a broad depth of experience, even by the time he reached Texas. And thinking about how young he was when he passed, he was such a young man when he was so active.
Well, that's one of the things I've often thought about is what could he have done had he lived longer. And let me thank you all again for having me here today. I've really enjoyed it. I appreciated your being here and inviting me to do this. And let me also tell you how much I appreciated TCU Press in terms of its support of this project. I've done 2 books with TCU Press now, and let me tell you, they are a class act. They are incredibly professional, and I have enjoyed working with them on both of these projects. And I think the Ruby book is they did a great job. So I appreciate you all again having me here today.
Well, thank you. I will pass that along to the press. I mean, I know we certainly value them as partners at the Center for Texas Studies. While we've been chatting, I do have one other question that's come in, and that is, do you know if he collaborated with John Mitchell, a Black politician from Burleson County of the Belltown Freedmen's Colony?
I can't answer that question straight out. I don't know. He might have. I know of Mitchell. Again, that goes back to the question that I couldn't answer. I would have really liked to have been with Ruby when he shows up at these local communities to talk with Blacks about education and about politics. The names may have coincide, but no, I don't know. That's my answer.
Okay. Well, I will just add that we've started getting several comments about what a great presentation this was and how
great.
everyone has enjoyed it. Really outstanding, someone has said. So, again, we thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. And hopefully there'll be a time in the future when we can bring you to TCU campus for a public lecture. And if we are able to do that, then we'll certainly let all of our friends and fans know. And then they'd have the opportunity to see you in person and maybe get a book signed. So we'll look forward to that. And
it'd be nice to be able to see my audience.
I'm sure. I know from experience. Yeah, that is a challenge, but you pulled it off beautifully.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Linda, do you have any other comments?
I just wanted to say thank you to you both. It was a great presentation and very informative. It's amazing how much Ruby accomplished in his lifetime.
Yeah. Very short life too.
Yeah, I agree. Well, okay. I'll close by saying, please join us on October the 6th for our program with Mark Presswood and the history of baseball. Wait, I think I said the 6th. I think it's actually the 2nd. Let's see.
2nd.
Yeah, October the 2nd, when we have Mark Presswood talking about the history of baseball in Fort Worth. Until then, we wish you a very happy weekend, and thank you all for being here.